Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the Thousand Year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to follow. Ryuken Ishida is one of Bleach's most mysterious characters. Even with the advent of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, an arc that was ostensibly all about the Quincy, Uryu's father and the self-proclaimed last Quincy, doesn't really get much to do at all. And yet there's always been an alluring mystique to the character nonetheless, as though there's still so much hiding beneath the surface yet to be uncovered. How strong really is he? What's he truly capable of? After all, it was this unassuming man who, against all odds, set into motion the ultimate defeat of Yūhabak himself by the end of the final arc, and I can't help but feel like he was sadly overlooked in a big way. I can't help but think that a lot of the curiosity surrounding Ryuken stems from the fact that he fits into that same exciting category of characters as the likes of Isshin, obviously, but also Kisuke, Yoruichi, and Tessai, extremely powerful warriors who exist in a sort of pariah state, seemingly separated at first glance from the events of the main story, but with whom there's clearly an intense history behind them and their actions, and whenever they do see fit to get involved, it's always a big deal. And of course, all of the characters on that list have been proven to be monstrously powerful at one point or another. Even Tessai got to really show his stuff in the Turn Back the Pendulum arc. But with Ryuken, the most we've truly seen amounts really only to fleeting teases here and there. Now, the anime has reintroduced Ryuken over 10 chapters earlier than he was supposed to appear based on the manga chronology, sparking discussion as to whether or not Ryuken's role will be expanded in the upcoming final core. Either way, Ryuken remains a fascinating character in my opinion, and today I want to dive a little deeper. How powerful really is this guy? What do we know? What can we glean from his very brief appearances in the story? And perhaps the most pertinent question to be asked today, how does he stack up to Uryu? Let's take a look. Of course, before we get started, consider hitting subscribe down below to help support the channel on our quest to reach 300,000 subs by the end of the year. I really would appreciate all of your support in reaching that goal. It does make a massive difference. And also check out my Patreon as well if you want to take your support for the channel that extra step further. Again, that's making a huge difference as well, so thank you all so very much. To begin with then, what do we actually know about Ryuken? What do we see? And that answer is, regrettably, not a lot. In his own words, as the so-called last Quincy, Ryuken is the sole heir to the powers and skills of the late Ryuken Ishida, even going so far as to wield the same Quincy cross that Uryu's grandfather once possessed, a family heirloom that seems to have been passed down, whether voluntarily or not. As an ect or pure blood Quincy, Ryuken is presumably capable of reishi dominion to an extensive and impressive degree, though again we never really get to see this take shape. And actually, speaking of him inheriting the powers and skills of the late Ryuken Ishida, again, we have no idea truthfully what that really means. Interestingly, one thing we do see is Ryuken's bow, and he uses a very different kind of bow to Uryu. In the very few instances we see of him actually wielding a bow, its appearance is much more akin to a short bow or a crossbow, and he tends to use it with just the one hand, as if firing a gun. Initially, his bow had an intricate, almost bone-like design, which also featured a bowstring and looked really cool in my opinion, but by the time of his final appearance in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, Ryuken appears to be using a new, even smaller bow, with much less going on and no apparent bowstring anymore, though admittedly the details on this panel, the one panel we see it, are very indistinct. But of course, Ryuken changing his bow since the last time we saw it, I guess would imply some kind of power increase, some kind of training and development, some evolution of his skill. There is also one other bow that Ryuken uses just once, and we'll get to that later. What's most interesting about Ryuken's bow, however, is the way it compares and contrasts to Uryu's own. While Uryu initially uses a bow made purely of energy, Ryuken's appears to be a solid construct, and is much smaller than anything Uryu uses for the most part. However, by the time of the Lost Agent arc, so 2 years after Aizen's defeat, Uryu has appeared to hone his powers to the point where he now wielded a bow that was very similar to his father's. Not only was it vastly more compact than anything Uryu had used in the past, but, like Ryuken's, it now appeared to be a solid construct as well. Basically, it resembled Ryuken's almost completely, albeit with a slightly different pattern, a slightly different superficial surface layer design, and we see it again at the very start of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, implying that obviously Uryu has retained that evolution of his power into the final arc, except things take a slightly weird turn. Now, I took this new bow of Uryu's after the time skip to represent, reasonably so I think, that Uryu's power had developed to the point where he was now on a level similar to his father, and their bows now looked that much more similar as a result, if we assume that Ryuken was stronger and more skilled than Uryu in the first place. There's technically no reason to assume that, but based on the way Uryu's bows evolved, that seemed to make complete sense to me, implying again that Ryuken's was a power that Uryu had attempted to achieve, and had after the time skip perhaps done so. Only strangely, after joining the Vandenreich, Uryu ditches this bow completely and goes back to using energy bows once again, albeit different ones from the Kojaku and Ginrei Kojaku he used prior to the time skip. Now, maybe this is a thematic thing and has nothing to do with power or the evolution of Uryu's power. It could be that if this bow is perhaps based on Soken's own designs or something like that, Uryu didn't want to sully it by using it while he was a member of the Vandenreich. But I'm not sure about that. First of all, it's complete conjecture, but also he doesn't return to using this smaller, solid bow once his true intentions are revealed. And also he further changes and evolves his energy bow in his battle with Hashwolf, so clearly its power is improving. And if that's the bow he's choosing to use against the Grand Master of the Sternritter in his final battle of the entire series, it would make sense that that is the highest current evolution of his abilities. To me, it's just kind of weird and seems to go against what Kubo was setting up visually previously, unless the simple truth, Occam's razor, is this smaller, tangible bow is stronger than Uryu's previous incarnations and yet weaker than the new energy bows he creates in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, which I guess is totally possible, but just feels like a really weird stopgap that doesn't really make sense to include, and kind of makes the solid construct smaller bow that Uryu has in the Lost Agent arc and at the start of the Thousand Year Blood War arc feel like, I don't know, something completely disconnected entirely. Anyway, I've gone way off the reservation here. Taking it back to Ryuken, everything we really know about what Ryuken is capable of comes from his brief stint of a training session with Uryu during the early stages of the Rankar arc, where Ryuken pushes Uryu to regain his lost Quincy powers, which of course disappeared as a result of him using the Let Steel during his fight with Mairi in the Soul Society arc. Now here, we can see that Ryuken's individual arrows are capable of causing huge explosions. That's not really anything new. But perhaps most interesting is his ability to, again with just the one hand, fire off a volley of arrows all at once, at extremely high speeds. Again, it feels a little like the character is meant to be wielding a gun, almost like a submachine gun or something like that he can rapidly fire with ease. We never really see Uryu firing arrows like this, certainly not with one hand. Now, I always feel that this panel in particular is quite interesting. I'm sure this isn't really what's happening, but it does kind of look to me like Ryuken's arrows are almost homing in on Uryu, as though they are leaving the bow at an angle, being fired off almost scattershot, and then chasing Uryu down. Again, I don't think that's explicitly the case, but it's kind of a cool idea, and it's also kind of interesting that we never really saw that from a single Quincy, I don't think. Earlier I mentioned that there is another bow that Ryuken used just once, and here it is. It's very similar to his short bow he wields in the Rankar arc, only it's well, much bigger. This is a much more traditional bow than Ryuken normally uses, and closely resembles Uryu's initial energy bow from the Thousand Year Blood War arc, save for one crucial difference. This bow of Ryuken's, although longer than before, still appears to be made of a solid material, though the bowstring is made of energy. With this bow, Ryuken generates a completely different arrow to any we've seen before. Not only is it huge and aflame, but the arrowhead is extremely well defined and intricate, and it kind of seems as well that the mere act of conjuring said arrow was enough to burn away Uryu's Gritz technique. Now, is this arrow a special arrow designed specifically to help restore Quincy powers? After all, that is the only time we've seen it used as far as I can remember, but even so, the mere fact that Ryuken is capable of this ritual in the first place, plus being skilled enough to accurately hit 19mm to the right of Uryu's heart's sinoatrial node, is obviously very impressive. That's highly specific. It's kind of an understated feat, but I would say a very impressive one all the same. And we kind of have to work with what we're given, because outside of this, Ryuken really doesn't do anything at all, at least in a combat scenario. We do see him gearing up to take on White in Everything But the Rain, 20 years ago or so, even ordering Katagiri to prepare the spiritual armaments, which sounds awesome. We get a very brief and incomplete look at said spiritual armaments, but sadly they arrive too late to actually get the chance to use them. Is this a new bow that Ryuken appears to have equipped on his Quincy outfit here, or is this particular armament maybe some kind of primitive version of Sail Schneider, for example? But yeah, I guess the important takeaway is that Ryuken's track record is essentially non-existent. So that brings us back to the central question: how strong really is this guy? It's of course extremely difficult to say, there's no sugarcoating it, but there's no doubt that Ryuken holds enormous pedigree as the self-proclaimed last Quincy, and wields immense skill as a result. Despite his distaste not just for the Quincy as an idea, as a race, but for being one himself, he's clearly incredibly well versed in not only their lore, but their customs and their rituals too, being capable and powerful enough to completely restore a Quincy's lost powers that came about as a result of using the Let Steel. He's a truly fiendish bowman, and displays enough power to instantly wipe out enormous Menos Grande hollows with 1 or 2 arrows apiece. At the same time, he's able to move and shoot fast enough and accurately enough to completely stop said hollow from using high-speed regeneration, and again fires with such pinpoint accuracy, even when it seems like he's barely trying. With the way he wields his one-handed shortbow like a gun, it pretty much feels like he deletes these enormous hollows at the click of a button, which is fitting, I think, for someone who is perhaps, at least at this point, supposed to represent the ultimate orthodox Quincy. On top of this, he's capable of using his unique bow and fighting style to overwhelm and push Uryu to his absolute limit. We really don't have much else to go off aside from clearly amazing skill with his bow and an intimate knowledge of Quincy techniques and abilities. There are contextual clues as well, of course, and this is purely my own speculation, but I can't help but imagine Ryuken probably has power equivalent to Isshin in the same way Uryu has power equivalent to Ichigo, as of course they share a similar dynamic. So how much stronger Ichigo is than Uryu is probably similar to Isshin and Ryuken occupies a similar role in terms of strength to the way Uryu does. As of course they share a similar dynamic, and narratively it makes complete sense to mirror them in almost every way, as again that's clearly what Kubo was going for. That's an oversimplification obviously, and really we're only talking about their quote-unquote average strength around the time of, say, the Soul Society arc or the Arankar arc. This is not counting the times where, of course, Ichigo's inherent nature causes him to become insanely more powerful than Uryu could ever imagine. This is looking at them from a average perspective. But what muddies the waters even further is Uryu's frankly astronomical jump in power as a result of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, especially the anime. In the same way Isshin, as powerful as he is, and he's clearly very powerful, could no longer realistically hope to really be anywhere near Ichigo, Ryuken, for as little as we know about him, must now be content with clearly lagging behind his son. And of course, in a way, this makes total sense. They are the next generation. Ichigo and Uryu should theoretically continue to grow and surpass their predecessors, but Uryu's jump in particular over where he was the last time he actively engaged with Ryuken in that kind of way feels completely absurd. Again, Ryuken has all the hallmarks of being an extremely capable and skilled Quincy. He's an Quincy, seems perfectly competent with Hirenkyaku, almost certainly can use Blute to a proficient degree, and likely studied under his father's tutelage, even though Everything But the Rain makes it appear as though Soken was maybe something of a distant father. Despite that, it is clear that even as recently as Everything But the Rain, Ryuken still held the Quincy's in very high regard. The one thing that calls his potential long-term skill into question for me is his clear desire to rid himself of his powers, and while he was apparently never successful, it also means there was likely a lengthy period of time where he didn't bother to train or even really acknowledge his Quincy skills. It wasn't just that he was hiding them from Uryu, he actively disliked them. And sure, while he bemoans the fact that his powers aren't as easy to be rid of as Uryu's were, it still means he likely hasn't used them at all for some time. So then, how does Ryuken compare to Uryu these days? It's difficult to know for sure, as we simply have zero idea what Ryuken's upper limit is. But let's face it, he definitely doesn't have a Shrift, probably doesn't have a Volsten dish, and is likely missing all of the modern bells and whistles that come from being a member of the Vandenreich. We're missing a lot of context regarding Soken and the Vandenreich, specifically their relationship, but if Soken was made a pariah by these militant extremists, then it's likely they look upon Ryuken in exactly the same way, meaning he almost certainly doesn't have access to any of their technology or occult magic. Admittedly, Soken did manage to sequester away a sun key, so who knows what secrets Ryuken is hiding as a result, though I don't think it's too many. Again, as I said, Uryu's power jump has been completely stratospheric, to the point where he's now duking it out with Zero Division members and even killing them outright thanks to his Shrift. What we really need, of course, is a new battle for Ryuken in the anime, and I remain cautiously optimistic that we'll get it. If Ryuken arrives with extra time to spare, and so far it seems as though he's going to, he absolutely could help Uryu take on Hashwolf. I see no reason why not. It would be a big departure from the manga, but ultimately would absolutely work. Once they've dealt with Hashwolf, or Yhwach has, depending on whether or not the anime keeps the ending of their fight the same, Ryuken can then give Uryu the still silver arrow as Uryu prepares to leave. Exactly the same major plot beat as in the manga. This could also give us the insight we need, because it will show us how well Ryuken can keep up with not just Hashwolf but Uryu as well. It'll show us if he takes a frontline role in their fight or merely supports his son from the sidelines. It could even show us the extent of Ryuken's current grasp of Quincy techniques. Does he have a Volsten dish? Maybe he uses Let Steel to finally rid himself of his Quincy powers once and for all. In fact, maybe he has tried to use Let Steel in the past and failed, hence his dialogue noting that his powers are harder to get rid of. So how strong is Ryuken really? It's very hard to say, but to give an answer to the best of my abilities, I think the likeliest scenario for the character is that his level of power is comparative to Isshin's in the same way Uryu's was to Ichigo's in the Urankar arc, or perhaps even the Soul Society arc, considering Uryu simply doesn't have a great showing in the Urankar arc through no real fault of his own. Basically saying that Ryuken is very skilled and powerful and capable of taking on captain-level fighters, and while beneath Isshin in terms of power, he's still someone that Isshin is willing to go into battle with, and willing to trust, with them likely having each other's backs. While I know Ryuken likely didn't want anything to do with the fight against Aizen, probably viewing it as the Shinigami's problem, ultimately it makes no sense to me that he wasn't involved, since Shinigami feud or not, his hometown was Aizen's target, and he should have been there to face off with Aizen alongside Isshin, Kisuke, and Yoruichi. I said before that when we saw that mysterious silhouette during Deicide that turned out to be Don Kunoji, one of the top suspects was Ryuken. Though of course he likely wouldn't have been able to achieve anything on his own at that stage of Aizen's evolution, but yes, he should have been involved, and I have a hard time believing that he would perform significantly worse than those three, simply due again to those contextual clues. Of course, that's conjecture, but the fact that narratively he is held in a similar regard to Isshin, albeit the Quincy version, of course. Alright, but that's it for today's video, a slightly shorter one, but again, I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Just how powerful do you think Ryuken Ishida really is? From the very little that we've seen of this guy, what do you expect from him were he ever to be involved in a true combat scenario? Do you think he will have an expanded role in the final core of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime, and if so, will that involve him getting a part to play in Uryu vs Hashwolf? And if so, how's he going to be involved? How does he stack up to his own son now in regards to their command, their mastery of Quincy powers and techniques? I'd love to get all of your thoughts down in the comments below, so do please let me know. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already. It's so easy and so quick to do, totally free as well. Just hit the button down below to help push us towards 300,000 subs. You can be a part of that journey. It would be greatly appreciated. And if you want to take the support for the channel another step further, then consider joining my Patreon as well to get your name in the credits of every single video like this. And at the $2 tier or higher, you can get all of my videos free of YouTube ads as well. So please consider doing that today. If you like what you see here and you want to help keep the lights on, it would be greatly appreciated. Alright everyone, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.